You are listening to Seeking the Hidden Thing with Kryptos. Welcome everyone to another episode of Seeking the Hidden Thing. It is my pleasure to have again, back in the days when I was doing the Christian Ghetto podcast, Athenian is one of my fellow group chat members, and it's always a pleasure to message with him, talk with him, discuss the classics, discuss philosophy, pretty much just to discuss just about any subject, as we've been doing off the air now for about 20 plus minutes and all morning on text messaging and stuff. So anyways, welcome, Athenian.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this. I love whenever I get a chance to, be on your show or the other guys in the chat. It's always such a great time talking with you guys because, you're serious about these things, and it's enjoyable talking with serious people about these things. So.
Well, and for everybody who doesn't know Athenian deeply, you are probably one of the most well-read people that I know. So it's always a little intimidating because I'm well-read, but you're taking it to a next level generally. And I've had a professional life where I spent many years just doing things like indulging myself in reading fantasy fiction. And I would go back and forth. Sometimes I'd read some philosophy, but ever since coming back online, I have been hard at the books, so to speak, and enjoying it immensely. And I've been very inspired by your dedication to reading the source material, especially the primary sources, and doing depth reading, close readings, which is really the only way to read it. And so, like many who talk to you, they say, I'm just so intimidated to talk to Athenian because he's so well read, and I don't want to sound like an idiot.
No,
and that's the way it goes, right? So that's the kind of, when everybody has you on, that's kind of the common refrain is like, I'm about to talk to Athenian, I'm so worried that I'm going to sound like an idiot. You know what I mean?
I want to be the first person to let everyone know, do not feel that way. I just happen to be a guy who has chose this field of study, philosophy, as my profession, college and everything like that, and graduate school. So I just have that. My knowledge of these things only comes because that's what I've been trained to do. I've been trained to do this my whole life. I mean, I was preparing to be a college professor, and and then the world goes crazy, and I'm like, okay, I don't want anything to do with those people. But this particular topic, this is where, I always have to be careful because I don't want to just casually bring up stuff that other people might never even have heard of before. And so this particular topic is going to really test me. And so I have to make sure that I'm still intelligible, that people don't even know. I don't want to start name dropping these various thinkers and people are like, who the hell is that? So I'm going to
drop a bomb on you.
Well, I'm going to try to be as recognizable in the sense of particular thinkers, while emphasizing the kind of subtleties that have defined. We have to be very clear here. There's a difference between paganism and modern paganism, which is to say, what most people think paganism really is. It's just modern. It's a construct, and it comes from a topic that is really like ground zero for my own research and expertise on these things in Germany. And in any case, all this is to say that this has everything to do with what we casually take for granted in terms of things like poetry, in terms of things like history, and I mean these in the sense of concepts. History as a concept. What do we even mean when we say history? What do we even mean when we say poetry? And in particular, things like modernity. What do we even mean by that, right? And so all of those things, the very specific meaning of what they are, come tumbling out of this discussion, because this discussion is a product of all of those things. And that's what gives it such great richness. particularly because it defines the world that we understand as our world today. And some of the stuff that I sent you earlier, before doing this, that word, world, and in particular, world construction, right? That's crucial in this, because that becomes everything. In other words, man creates his own world, and the creation of that world is going to absolutely involve the creation of his own divinities, his new gods, and in particular, a new mythology. I mean, these are the most important philosophers of the 18th and 19th century who are literally saying this. They're saying we need a new mythology. They're fabricating, in many respects, old gods that didn't even apply to them, or they're fabricating an old Christianity that didn't apply to them, or something like that. And so that's what so very much of all of this that really gives it that sort of sense of urgency, that we truly make sure that we understand what we're talking about here, because it is so definitive of everything about our world today, which all comes back around, by the way, also to the rise of what we understand as biblical hermeneutics, right? How do you even read the Bible? What does it mean to read the Bible, to interpret the text? So someone very near and dear to you, for instance, Gadamer. Mm-hmm. Gadamer is going to be the culmination of exactly this topic. I mean, you could say maybe some other thinkers, like, you could add Foucault there, or Derrida, or something like that, but they're all on the very tail end of exactly what this topic is and how it gets set into motion, beginning around 1800. So anyway, sorry, long-winded.
And because I didn't even frame this before Athenians started talking. I mean, the reason why we're getting together today is to talk about, and it's interesting, I don't know, maybe because Trump is such a sensitive topic that, we've gone away from, prior to Trump coming into office, criticizing the regime. Well, if you can't criticize the regime and people are still enjoying the afterglow of the Trump victory and election and the early days of the administration, such that, offering substantive critiques of either Trump, his administration, or the likelihood and possibilities of his success are verboten. Well, what do then people begin to talk about if they can't critique the regime? Because that in many ways was what bound a lot of these disparate groups together. Well, then you begin to just turn on each other and begin focusing on the things that you disagree about. And one of the significant disagreements that has existed on the sort of online right has been this divide between Christians and it used to be broader. Back in the day, they used to call them sort of like the Greeks. And then there was like, the Vitalists and there was the BAP crowd, like we're a bunch of, Greek pirates, these types of things. So we're, the Bronze Age mindset is, falls into this category in some way. But recently there has been an upsurge. And I know that my experience as a Canadian, there have been a number of especially as Canadians, we kind of said, well, since this whole Trump thing is going on and we're maybe not as welcome as we used to be in just to speak our minds, let's just go and deal with our own house. Well, it turns out that there was a deep divide in the Canadian political scene between a number of guys who style themselves as neopagans and those of us who are Christians. And I have long argued for various reasons that, along like what you say, is that at the heart of every civilization is a set of religious beliefs, and law is downstream from religion, morality is downstream from religion, and law is downstream from morality. And so, without a religious idea that binds a people together that can express itself in law, you can't build a nation. And so, there really has been, the battle is really between whatever, as you say, whatever rose up in the 17 and 1800s to oppose Christianity, and Christianity. This is really where the main battle lines in the West are, in my mind, and continue to be. And so this neo-paganism stuff is yet another expression of guys who are, quote unquote, in our sphere, in large part because they hate the liberal regime, the managerial regime, whatever it is, and they don't want to be Christians, and so they're looking around for some other organizing belief. And as you and I talked about online, many of them, because they refuse to face the nihilism of what happens when you don't believe, they will grasp at whatever belief seems most amenable to them. And today it's kind of neo-paganism. And this is really why I wanted to talk to you, Athenian, because you know the literature and know that what seems like sort of a spontaneous embrace of neo-paganism, of old beliefs made new, and all the claims that are made about it, really has a 200 to 300 year history. And the quote unquote neo-paganism of today is anything but neo. These are more or less recycled ideas that got a lot of play in the 1800s, and the disastrous effect of them are now still today playing themselves out in the nihilism of our society, because they work directly to undermine the Christian faith in European civilization, and that had severe downstream consequences. And I think that roughly encapsulates. So here we are talking about neo-paganism. So I don't know where you want to begin with it. You want to start at the beginning, or I'll let you maybe frame it however you want to frame it, Athenian, and then we can go from there.
Yes. The way I like to phrase these discussions is, in order for people to understand exactly the significance, it's usually best to begin with where we are, make sure we understand where we're at, and then go back and see, okay, well,
Sure.
what about, where does this arise from? So probably one of the most important markers for where we are right now, this is going to be something like the Grimm brothers of the 19th century. The Grimm brothers were the ones who wrote a number of these fairy tales.
Mm-hmm.
And what the fairy tales they wrote were specifically for was concerning the Germanic gods.
Mm-hmm.
And they did this specifically because what was happening in Germany was that they could not find in the historical record the connection between the Germans and the Greeks. So what does one do then? And see that gets compounded because what has happened is, there's two different ways to think of this. There's the philosophical component of things, which, beginning with Rousseau and then Kant responds to him, they find out that the very premises of modernity, of liberalism, they don't hold. And so then and so Kant has to establish what it is that man can even know. And it turns out that that's going to have enormous significance with regard to man's relationship to what he considered to be the divine. And that leads directly into biblical hermeneutics and things like this, consequences of it. But ultimately, so Kant's claim is that we simply cannot know, we don't have access to things in themselves. We can only understand the reasoning of the mind, right? And so, in other words, metaphysics is out the door, and all you have now is epistemology. Now, the consequences for that are nothing less than nihilism as we understand it. And in other words, man doesn't really know what to believe anymore. And this is how Nietzsche defines nihilism.
You can have no sure beliefs anymore. That's what we're told. Like you cannot have any, sure claim at any truth at all. Like nothing. Everything exactly. Everything has to be questioned, and you can't believe in anything.
Well, exactly. The the beginning point, I guess we could say, of universal doubt, right? That's goes back to Descartes.
Card.
But then what Kant does is he makes it popular by saying, "Dare to know." Don't
Mhm.
take the faith of your preacher. Don't take the faith of your educators. You yourself have to be your own tutor, right? And in order to do that, one has to just sort of question everything.
Mhm.
Now, that's very dangerous at a popular level because, I mean, this goes all the way back to Thucydides. Thucydides flatly says in the Peloponnesian War, in the opening section, he says, so lazy are the majority of men with regard to wanting to know the truth of things that they will just simply grab for whatever is closest at hand and say, okay, and be satisfied with it. And that becomes dangerous. But that's
Mhm.
just the philosophical component. There's another component that's at play here but it's just as important, and this is the so-called ancients and the moderns. Now, this goes back much further. This actually never stopped. Uh, what you have is in the Renaissance in particular, uh, we have new knowledge comes along, new texts,
Mhm.
and the the West didn't even know what to make of them. They didn't even know these texts of Plato and Aristotle and stuff existed. I mean, there was so much that they, I mean, in particular Greek tragedy, they had no idea that it even existed, and so they had to establish, what have we been missing out on? Which is to say, they had to find a way to understand that new reception of old knowledge in light of what they thought was old knowledge. And this becomes especially fascinating for the Renaissance because what that means is we that's when we begin to see the inkling of the rise of this thing called history. And the debate that takes place, and it's going to be hermeneutics, the debate that takes place is the most thoughtful of the humanists are flatly going to argue on what it means to read, for instance, Seneca, uh, or well, let me rephrase that, Plutarch, right? Um, they say well, I want to understand Plutarch, but in order to do that, I have to fully understand what Plutarch means by the words that he uses, which means that I have to fully understand his time, his age. And other incredibly thoughtful thinkers said, no, 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 no. That's just in other words, you're just questioning everything so much that the text just falls apart. And they say, no, no, no. What we need to do is read these great thinkers and look towards them as models that can provide us with guidance of what we should live up to in our own life. And that's where you get the parting of the ways. There's the philological interpretation of text to try to understand, what did they even mean by this? In other words, to contextualize the thinker, which means that you have to understand their time. And then on the other hand, you have thoughtful people saying, no, 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 no. We can just take what we like of them and make that something of our own. And these people are at war with each other. I mean, they are
Mhm.
just incredibly at war, and it spills over into the Catholic Church and such. But that erupts into the so-called quarrel of the ancients and the moderns in France. Now, the significance of this is so important because what it's going to lead to, for instance, is people like Kojev and Schmidt, uh, because the question of the quarrel was, what are we to make of Greek tragedy? Uh, because tragedy in particular was the most important. And the reason that this becomes the most important is, one could say, the French Revolution or something. Well, what do we even mean by that? Well, the reason Greek tragedy was so important was because Athens was the site of, for instance, democracy, which gets interpreted, right, as human freedom. So
Mm.
it was no longer an issue of, well, do we find moral qualities of Oedipus, the striving of, this kind of thing, or is it an entirely new realm of thinking as such because it demonstrates the role of human agency within what we could think of as, I guess, the phenomenal whole, right? In other words, the relationship between God and man within the rubric of democracy, which is to say freedom, because that's what is new under the sun, is this emphasis upon human freedom. And that's where things just really spiral, because the philosophers are going to take this and they're going to say, okay, tragedy is the highest perfection of human nature, and it shows itself with regard to human freedom. And that's why you end up, for instance, with a Kojève in the early 20th century France, who's a Hegelian. And Hegel is, everything in Hegel goes back to Antigone in many respects, but especially tragedy. And Schmidt, on the other hand, also has an enormous amount to say about the role of tragedy, right? Hecuba, etc. And it's because they understand these things as a new realm of human thought. So the question then becomes, how are we to place the ancients within the new world of modernity? Is it a seamless fit? Or is it something that's very problematic? Because if it's the case that you cannot fit them in, then what becomes of this thing as the best of human agency or freedom, the noblest, in other words, the heroic, what does it mean to be great, is itself fundamentally tragic, because you can never achieve it. If you cannot reconcile the greatness of that which you are imitating, you can never do it. You can try, but you'll never succeed. Well, that itself is fundamentally, in many respects, what it means to be tragic, when the good man fails in trying to do the good deed. And so that's when life itself begins to be understood as tragic. This is nothing less than the title of Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy. That's why tragedy becomes so crucial for these people. That's why tragedy is crucial for Heidegger. That's why tragedy is crucial for Schmidt, why it's crucial for Kojève.
Even Kierkegaard.
Absolutely. Kierkegaard is very much involved in all this as well, because Kierkegaard is going to be responding to Hegel. And in order to even respond to these people, you have to understand where they're coming from with regard to the role of the significance of tragedy. And again, I just want to, now I know this sounds very, very foreign to most people, because they're like, what are they even talking about? Look, man, I'm just looking at the history, and I'm telling you that, Christianity is a fraud. And we had these Germanic folk, the Volk, etc. Well, here's the problem there. The very notion of the Volk, of the people, well, and not just the Volk, but what we commonly understand as the zeitgeist, right? The spirit of the time. Both of those words come from one of these founders of late modernity, Hegel. I'm sorry, not Herder. Herder is the one who's, and it's because they're trying to understand, how can we even write history? What does it mean for us to even write history now if we're fundamentally disconnected from them? And so the very notion of the Volk, or the zeitgeist, is new under the sun. It's very new under the sun.
Wow. Or you get to like Spengler, where he eventually just gets to the point where he says there is no connection. The Greeks and the Germans are incommensurable. There's no connection at all, right? And he just argues they're two different cultures that are alien to each other. There is no connection.
Even that word, that's another thing that sort of people get frustrated with me, because that word culture is what gets birthed out of this discussion. Herder, by the way, the same one who gives us the Volk and the zeitgeist, he's the one who gives us this new word culture. It's with Herder. Well,
with a K in the German, yeah.
The thing to remember though about it is that what I mean when I say that he gives us this word culture, it's the first time that the word culture ever gets used without the genitive. In other words, the cultivation of the soul, the of there is the genitive. So it's always very particular. It applies only to one person. It had always been understood as that until Herder. That's when Herder begins to speak of the culture of an entire people. Now, just think about what that means. That requires, that fundamentally requires the notion of enlightenment, right? And so that's what's at issue with these things. So
it's
that's why
I was going to say, it's almost like the verbal similarity there is turning impact into a verb. Like that impacted him, which is just completely shifts the meaning of, that had an impact on me. And so they're doing a similar sort of thing with the word to cultivate then becomes, a state of being, a culture.
Yeah. And let me just emphasize, because this is not a matter of semantics. People say, well, culture, the word civilization also arises at the same time in France. And it's never pluralized. There's only been one civilization. It's always been French. But the Germans with Herder introduced they introduced the word culture. Now the significance of this is, someone will say, well, hold on, what existed before culture? That's what has to be answered. And the answer to that is this thing we know of as citizenship. Citizenship was that which the individuals of a political community would always strive to raise themselves up to. So whether it was with regard to piety, whether it was with regard to the mind or civic responsibility, these kinds of things, that was what was otherwise known as culture. But it wasn't all lumped together insofar as what we understand as culture is this mixing where people say, well, it's their literature, it's their religion. Well, is it truly the case that you can just casually say, well, religion, literature, they're all the same, right? Because with citizenship, there was a hierarchy. But with culture, there's not. It's just this sort of conceptual term that just throws everything together and says that's the people.
It's the mix of it all. Yeah, even if you were looked to from the Hebraic tradition, you have the people of God. Like the Greek would talk about the civic life, the city, the polis, and within the Hebraic mind, you would have the covenant people. But then the covenant people has a God that they believe in, and everything is downstream from those two things. So God forms the people, and the people then in covenant relationship with God then have a faith, and that begins to impact everything down. So that establishes the law, that establishes the community, and so forth. And that frames basically everything else. There is not sort of, like you say, this kind of mishmash of Israelite culture.
Yeah, I get very frustrated because what one has to understand, and I look, I've got all of these texts in front of me, and there's just no time, right? Because you guys like y'all keep it an hour and a half.
I'm not so worried about that as most, but maybe just a way to look at. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the thing is, what is required of this word culture, if it's going to be as it is used without the genitive, which is to say not specific, it's universal. It's a universal thing. What's required is, in fact, a version of nihilism, which is to say relativism. So that's what has to be understood. So when people start speaking of religious culture, it's like that's a contradiction in terms. That because what's required to even begin to use the word culture is a relativism, and Herder is very specific about this. Herder flatly says there's no real difference between these other cultures or anything. They're just all sort of unique in their own way. In other words, every culture is like a deck of cards, right? You just got a deck of cards, and you can put them in your back pocket, and just pull out whichever one is needed on the occasion. And that's going to be the problem, because from exactly that is going to end up tumbling out where we are today with this understanding of nihilism, where people just don't even know what to believe at all anymore, and they just flatly don't care to really believe in anything very principled. It's like, well, that's your truth, right? It's, this is my truth, or something like that.
Well, and in some sense, to frame it historically, and this is, correct me if I'm wrong, sort of my understanding somewhat of it, as these older texts are rediscovered during the early and full flowering of the Renaissance period, and all of this new knowledge is flooding into European society, and they're grappling with what to do with it. One of the streams that begins to take root is what we know today as like the Hermetic or alchemal, like alchemy, basically, the alchemal tradition and so you have, there's a group of like a loose diffuse network of guys that start pouring themselves into alchemy, hermeticism, and secret knowledge. That there has been, in some sense, there's been all this knowledge. I don't know whether they saw it as I don't think they saw it as a conspiracy, but all of this knowledge had been unknown or kept from them, and now all of a sudden, it was beholden upon them to embrace this and make of it what they will. But these Hermetic beliefs then reawaken over time. They begin to undermine, because again, as you say, that we need they want a freedom to learn and explore whatever beliefs or whatever knowledge comes up, regardless of the predilections of the Christian Church, of the Catholic Church, the Roman Church. So, they didn't want Rome telling them what they could or couldn't learn. And they wanted to be able to explore all these texts and learn all these texts. And so this begins, and this sort of flows and interweaves with the universities, and they want to explore all of these different ideas, all these different texts, and it begins to, at least among the intellectual set and the academics, begins to undermine the centrality of the church and its hold on knowledge. Then in the 1400s, you get the printing press. These ideas begin to get to be more widely disseminated. And then, as you say, there's the people like the brothers Grimm and others who in the 18th century or 1800s begin to go scouring for more of these old texts. So what that's they want then,
that's the key. They're rifling through every possible text that they can come across to justify
old monasteries everywhere they could go, old palimpsests, and they're scouring the world for all this, because they're looking, as you say, they're looking for the fundamental equivalent of the Greek texts that are the same for the Germanic peoples. So they want to so then you get like the Ring of the Nibelung, Beowulf is rediscovered, the Poetic Edda and there's even like some very, very well-respected scholars, in Tolkien being probably the primary one, and also C.S. Lewis to some degree, but they are also involved in it because they're trying to integrate and they're trying to give a rebirth to an essential English mythology. And so they're trying to, in a positive way, reignite an essentially English literary history, the way that that would be like unique to the Germanic peoples, as the Greek gods were to Athens and so forth. So they're looking to reignite this tradition, and so they develop ideas about how do you understand the pagan gods and so forth. Well, they're not really, because the classic Christian teaching was that you're basically worshiping the demonic, right? And so and you can see this in Revelation. I was just reading Revelation where the author of John falls down at his feet to bow before the angels who are giving him the revelation, and they say to him, like, don't bow before me, that give that only to God. And so there's a long Christian tradition where the fallen angels were those who took human worship for themselves and thus set themselves up as gods. And so the longstanding Christian teaching is that the gods of the people were basically angels that were assigned to certain peoples or regions that, instead of offering up worship to God, were seduced by Satan and then began taking worship up to God themselves. And so one of the things that some of these authors tried to do and this is in like sort of the late 1800s, pre-World War II, they were trying to sanctify these older traditions to give a rebirth. Then what happens is World War II happens, Hitler happens, and all of a sudden, looking into all of these Germanic myths becomes, it has a bad odor in it. Nobody wants to be a scholar in the ancient Germanic tradition because it has the whiff of Wagner and all of these guys that then were accused of giving birth to Nazism. So you can't look into Germanic myths anymore because that Germanic myths are bad, right? And so now that this sort of post-war consensus has begun to fall apart, guys are beginning to rediscover some of this old tradition, but some of these authors again. And so you get a lot of these, a lot of the work that was being done in around there. So, you get authors like Mircea Eliade and some of the meta-religion people. And so they're discovering all of this scholarly work that was done in the 1800s of these old Germanic myths. And they're, in my mind, and what they do then is they take this stuff on face value, like, these are the gods of my ancestors, and Christianity succumbed to liberalism and was weak, and what I need are these strong gods. And people don't consider the fact, and like, I love the Lord of the Rings and think that, Tolkien probably among all of these types of scholars did the best to navigate that fine line between his Catholic faith and, sort of the deep history of the English people and its belief systems. But he did so very clearly, I think, in a fictional context, because, as a Catholic, I think deep down he knew, right? And so by fictionalizing it, it then sanitizes and makes it safe, because you're not actually going to believe any of this stuff. It's just a story, but it's a story that in his way of doing it allows you to reconnect with something that's essentially English in a way that maybe you haven't connected with your quote unquote deep roots before. And I think that's one of the reasons why the story works, because it does have an ethnic, it does touch a sort of an ethnic vein that runs beneath the surface, sort of, almost maybe genetically programmed, but he's doing in something that basically was reignited. Because, as you look into sort of a lot of these texts, like Beowulf and the Ring of the Nibelung and the Poetic Edda, all had deep filterings through Christianity. Like even the earliest texts we have are all significantly edited through by Christian authors who were trying to take forward into this new faith their older teaching. But they were doing this in the 900s, the 800s, 900s. And that's still at the point where Europe hasn't yet been even fully Christianized. And by the time the 1300s comes, it's just mostly done. Like, there's nothing left of it, largely because, frankly, Germanic beliefs are bleak. Like Ragnarok is a very bleak belief, and you see it most clearly in the Vikings. It's basically a death cult. So it's kind of hard then, when you get to now 2025 and you see guys trying to revive this whole thing. You look at it from a long historical perspective, it automatically rings suspect in my mind, because again, as you say, you're kind of in a world of nihilism where you don't believe anything. You can't believe the Christian faith of your parents or grandparents, but you want to believe something because, facing nihilism is just too hard. Well, what do? Well, you go jonesing around for something that sounds fantastic. So you could be like BAP and you go back to Bronze Age heroes, or you go down to some of these neo-pagan and they're like, well, we need to get the Germanic gods of our real ancestors, and not this Christian overlay that basically extinguished it at the point of a sword. And you're like, really, like they just don't even understand how Christianization actually happened. But anyways, that's kind of my take on the history. If there's anything in there like you want to correct or anything, like, by all means go ahead. But that's kind of my understanding of kind of where it began and how we got to where we are.
Yeah, one of there's a couple points that I would just add there. So first of all, one of the biggest stumbling blocks that I see right out of the gate is that you mentioned, for instance, Iliad. There are a number of these 20th century authors and in the 19th century who offer up just entire theories of, and even, for instance, the most popular sort of being like Jung and things like this, right? There's the archetype of this or the archetype of that. Well, okay, hold on. Maybe. But that's a grand theory of how to even understand the whole history of it. Have you, in fact, looked into the history, right? Because in other words, that they might not fit nicely into these categories that you're saying they do. And that's what's so crucial about keeping an eye on, for instance, like what I was mentioning earlier, like Herder, Winkelmann actually before Herder, and the very debate between the ancients and the moderns that arises in France out of the Renaissance, right, of these kinds of things. Because usually the people that will buy into a lot of the grand theory kind of stuff, like either Jung or Iliad or something, they're not even aware of the actual history of it. So that's one problem. But then the other problem is, in fact, history itself, because that's the whole difficulty of saying, who are your ancestors really? Because, see, that was the problem that arose with the new texts that came in. They didn't even know those things existed, and they had already sort of started building up a tradition.
So how can they be your ancestors' texts if you didn't even know they existed until yesterday?
Right, and one way to see this is think of it this way. What most people know of the book of Genesis comes from Milton's Paradise Lost. That's how they understand that's how effective and persuasive these creations of new myths become when they begin to sort of when you have these poetic authors who take little pieces of things that we know a little bit about, and then they do their artistic work. Similarly, for this notion in Catholicism of purgatory, they get it from Dante. This is Dante, and that's what happens in the late, the last quarter of the 19th century with Wagner. That's why Nietzsche and Wagner are teamed up together initially with this notion of the festival at Beirut. That what Wagner and Nietzsche had envisioned was that they bring the best of the artists, poets, and dramatists, etc., of the time, in order to create a new mythology. That because their understanding of things of Germany at the time was that the vitality of the German people had died, and so the only thing that could resurrect it would be this new mythology. Now that's going to go back even a little bit further to, for instance, what I had mentioned earlier. I mean, Schlegel and Schiller actually are the ones who invoke the claim that we need a new mythology, and the sort of the founding document of German idealism. It's just a roughly 4 pages anonymous note that was. Everyone sort of understands now that it was written by probably Hegel, but it was a collaborative effort with Hegel, Schiller, and possibly Novalis. But that whole sort of group, that's what they're calling for, is this new mythology and stuff, because on the one hand, they don't know what the old is. Right. In other words, we can't find connections there. The history is not there. And to the extent that people will say that history can be made scientific, well, good luck with that, because it's not what you think it is. And so the issue then is this. I'm trying to think how to phrase this. The claim is always that the old is the good, right? That's what that has the most power. That comes, by the way, that comes right out of Plato. Plato's Athenian Stranger and Socrates in the Republic. So the Athenian Stranger in the Laws and Socrates in the Republic, they both say that the old is the good, but they say we don't have access to the old. And what's the oldest of the old? Well, that's the divine. And so how does one find that? And if one can't have access to it, what are you to do what are you to do going forward? And that's the reason that Plato, Socrates, and his Athenian Stranger create the so-called noble lie. The noble lie concerns whatever the old is that connects a people to its earliest origins. Mm-hmm. And so that's what's going on in these two renaissances, right? You have the Renaissance that takes place that everyone's familiar with like the 14th, 15th century. But then you have the second Renaissance, that's what's taking place in Germany of the 18th and the 19th century. And just to add a little bit further to this, you had mentioned England. Well, what's fascinating about this is that the road from late modern Germany back to Greece, ancient Greece, took place by way of Tudor England's Renaissance, and in particular, the German discovery of Shakespeare. That doesn't take place until 1762. So the Germans didn't even know Shakespeare existed until 1762, but they were so blown away by him and what he was doing for the English people, right? I mean, there's a good case to be made that the collection of Shakespeare's plays provide a history of the English-speaking people. And they saw this, the Germans saw this, the most thoughtful of them saw this, and they said, we need a German Shakespeare. And so that's what you're going to see rising up with these, I mean, right. And that's also, by the way, again, sort of like what the Brothers Grimm were doing, is they're saying, look, we've got to create these, we have to connect ourselves to the old. We don't really know what the old is, but in the absence of that knowledge, this poet or artist, can create something that's still beautiful and magnificent, that can place what we think might be the old into what we know is us right now, the new, right? So, again, you're getting back to this question of how does one bring the ancient into the modern? We know what the modern is; it's us. But the question is, what is us, right? How are we linked to what is our lineage? That's what we're trying to find. And when they can't find it, or there are significant problems finding it, the only way out is by way of artists, or you often get what we see today now as positivism, of just the scientists take it all over completely. But that's the role of the discovery of tragedy, the role of tragedy in all of this, because the art and science were combined in the German tradition, most definitively German idealism and Schiller. Hegel is doing this as well. Hegel, Schiller, Novalis, all of them are doing this. They're not drawing a distinction between the scientific and the artistic. And in fact, what they're arguing is that the artistic realm is the highest manifestation of philosophy itself. That dies because you have the scientists who are making their own discoveries in physics and chemistry, and they're saying, we don't need all that artistic stuff. We just it's just the facts, it's the science. And so art and science split paths, and they never come back together. But there's always that role of us simply as being humans, of this allure to the beautiful. And we think that if it's true, it has to be beautiful, right? And so we're always drawn back into the realm of art and trying to find a way to fit art and science together. And again, I mean, the fruition of all this in many respects is Nietzsche. He's the culmination. He's not the birth of it. He's the culmination of it. And then postmodernism takes its lead from there. And it just fractures into sort of like 1,000 different things. And that's where we are now. And so what we have now with the various neo-paganisms, right? Because remember, all of this is on the heels of what we know of as neoclassicism. That's the whole point of the word neoclassicism. They're trying to take the ancients or the classics and make them new again, neo, right?
Live again.
Exactly. That's what we would think of as these vitality movements.
Real and living. What's really interesting is that when you get an author like Spengler and his pessimism, and in part, reading it this way, Spengler would be an answer then to this kind of optimism that people have, that you can revivify the Greeks within German culture. And that's, in a sense, the argument is fundamentally is you can't. But Spengler also, and I think he's correct in this, is that if you take out, or if you take the historical arc of the classical culture, that the Greeks stand at a very similar point in the history of Greek society to where, people like, Hegel and Nietzsche and Schiller and others stood in relationship to the Western society, in that it was already past its generative period, and they were, in a sense, it was already dying or dead, and they were just sort of picking over the bones of it to, in some ways, maybe either revivify it or to just carry it on a little longer. And so that's sort of the one thought, I think. And that's why I think it's always sort of dangerous to go back to Greece as a quote unquote living tradition, because you can see in what you were talking about, the Athenian Stranger, like the old is good, that they were doing the very thing in their day that we're doing today, in a sense of trying to revive the poets, and this is in a sense why Socrates has to die, because he's running around questioning everybody's religious beliefs. And so he's corrupting the youth. Yeah, well, he was corrupting the youth. In that regard, he probably deserved to die. And so you get then today. Now, like from a theological perspective, I think maybe for some like who don't understand sort of why is this idea of tragedy so important? If you reject the Christian understanding of the fundamental problem, that we were created good and humanity fell into sin by disobeying God, you have to then come up with another theory for why things are all messed up, right? So you'll get Rousseau has his own theory in a sense of that, people are fundamentally neutral. If you can engineer society properly, then people will just, their inner goodness or whatever will just manifest itself because it has a good society around them. Whereas in these German authors were looking at the, correct me again if I'm wrong, Athenian, but they were looking at this notion of tragedy to explain why things get messed up. So in a sense, you turn it into kind of an artful spin, and that we're all living in the midst of a Greek play. And in the end, everything is just sad and tragic. We aspired to be great, but just couldn't reach there. And thus everything ends up being all messed up. And so what we need to do is just keep aspiring to greatness, and we'll keep kind of falling. But we'll have those brief moments where everything is right at the peak before it all just sort of falls apart again. And it's a kind of a bleak sort of look at the world. But that, as far as I understand, is my grasp of sort of why tragedy emerges. It's as a counter or as a response to, well, if you don't have the Christian notion of the fall and sin and a good creation, how do you explain why everything is messed up? And, this notion of tragedy sort of fills that void.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I would add here. Historically, what's interesting about this is that it's the reception of Aristotle's Poetics more than anything that really kicks this off in France, because they're translating from the Greek tragedies, and they also have access to Aristotle's Poetics. And Aristotle flatly says that tragedy is the highest form of poetry. And in addition to that, he says that poetry is more philosophic than history. And what he means by, and that's crucial. In fact, he goes further and says that what's so great about poetry and tragedy in particular is that it is a guiding or a leading of the soul. And he says the problem with history is that history doesn't do that. And we have to understand history is just as the word inquiry, historia. Well, that's the sort of Latinized version, but it just means to inquire into something. It doesn't mean a chronicle record of things as we understand it today. It just means to behold it and say, I'm just questioning. I'm curious about this. And Aristotle says that's not very high at all, because it doesn't lead the soul. But what is it leading the soul towards, right? Well, that's this thing called human nature. The perfection of which would be, as Aristotle makes clear, the mind. Now, that changes in this quarrel in the 17th, 18th century from France to Germany. That changes to where it's the perfection of the human is freedom, because they no longer believe in this notion of nature. And you see that just by it's in the name, the state of nature. Right? What is the state of nature? Well, Hobbes tells us it's fundamentally one of war. Locke and Rousseau really kind of follow in the same way that Hobbes does, but they put a nicer face on it, and they say, well, it's like neutral or maybe good. But the point is that the state of nature is something to be gotten away from. right? Once the state of nature is barbarism. We want culture and civilization. Well, how do you achieve that? Well, that is when the perfection of the human, they argue, is going to be this understanding of rational freedom or something like that.
Or with Rousseau, education.
And that was right. And that's the other thing I was going to add there, is that with Rousseau, what makes this so interesting is, and this is why Kant really just sort of takes over the entire philosophical tradition after Rousseau, is this comes from the social contract, his writing on governance. And I mean, I've got the text right here, and I could point you to the exact. Well, hold on. I think I wrote it down. Yeah, it's book 3, sections 11 and 12. Section 11, Rousseau talks about how it is that a people, this thing he refers to as the general will or something like this, right? He says how a people becomes corrupt. And then section 12, he says how the legislator is able to correct that corruption, the sovereign. And what Rousseau introduces he lets Pandora out of the box, and Pandora never gets back in. The legislator, the sovereign going forward, Rousseau says, has to be a kind of poet. He has to create a myth, new artistry that can monitor the general will, that can fashion the general will in the direction that he wants to go in. And so that's going to be what Kant has to find a way to fix, because for Kant that's unacceptable. It's not strong enough. It doesn't provide the kind of certainty that we need for political governance. And this is why Kant's response to Rousseau's general will is going to be the categorical imperative, which is so important for Kant. But all people need to know is that basically what Kant argues is that if you employ reason powerfully enough and focused enough, what you can demonstrate is that which is moral is that which you would demand be done in every instance of it, right? In other words, you never give an angry man a gun, right? That's rational. And with Kant, that's when we get the rise of objectivity, which is going to flourish into history. But the crucial point, so we have Rousseau's general will with this poet legislator, to Kant's categorical imperative of morality, of rational morality. And then, but the problem though is that Kant has undermined the notion of truth itself. We can't have access to it. There's no knowledge of the thing in itself. That's when Nietzsche comes into it, and Nietzsche introduces effectively eternal return of the same. So you've got general will, categorical imperative, and then eternal return of the same, which for Nietzsche is just, there's no reasoning involved in it. You're resolute. It's the rise of the will, human will in everything. It's not so much an issue of rationality anymore. It's not irrational, but it's not rational. It's just you resolve. You have an instinct for something. And really, that's sort of where we are now. We never have been able to get past Nietzsche because people don't believe in truth. They just believe, well, I have my gut tells me, my instinct tells me it's this, and that's where we're at.
Well, and this is exactly what Augusto Del Noce's point, and this is again why Carlo Lancelotti was, his translating of that from the Italian has been such a blessing, because in his books, especially like the problem of atheism, he confronts this head on. Is that atheism is now argued to be postulatory in a sense that there is no possibility to go back to a period of belief, right? So he argues that the two great political streams, so you have on the one hand sort of the positive stream, which includes liberalism, liberalism, the liberalism, capitalism, communism, that nexus, and in its religious form expressed in Marx, in a sense, capitalism reaches fulfillment, the present order is swept away, and then once the present order is swept away, then we'll enter into kind of a blessed utopia that will just kind of emerge once the present order is swept away. And then Del Noce also argues on the other side that there's you sweep away the present order, but you're doing so to reinstantiate some idyllic past. and sort of fascism falls into this. And so you look at some area in the past, some mythological, idea in the past. And so now you're going to reinstantiate this. But Del Noce argues is that you don't, the people that do that don't actually believe in it. In a sense, they're all dealing with a world that's post-Nietzschean. And
right.
And this is in a sense where he argues that Marx actually won, because, the hyper-capitalism that emerged after World War II had basically defeated communism. It had defeated fascism, but it had fully interiorized the atheism of Nietzsche, and then was looking to satisfy all of our needs materially, right? And so all of our needs could be materialized. It was all folded in, and now progress, rather than sweeping away the present order through this idea of human progress, we would manage our way into utopia, almost in a sense Rousseau's vision realized in that regard. But what Del Noce argues is that both of these are Nietzschean in a sense, is that they're not connected to any authentic religious belief, right? And so what he argues is that they're, between, capitalism, liberalism, communism on the one side, and fascism and its derivatives on the other side, sort of future utopianism and past utopianism, is that there's this notion of a living tradition of religious belief, which as a Catholic he saw as embodied in the Catholic Church. But there's a sense that you can, in this religious belief, you can re-encounter the fundamental grounding of reality. In a sense, you can meet God, and then, and this is where, like an author like I'm reading right now, the Russian author Florensky, Pavel Florensky, he's looking to, again, grappling with a lot of these materials, is arguing that within the Christian faith, there is a sense, all of these problems that the modernity has thrust upon us, all of these contradictions and so forth, find their resolution in the encounter with the divine. And that's only the place where they can find resolution. And so within the Western tradition, these authors are arguing is that all of these substitutes that you get, sort of the mythologizing that you have in the the rise of sort of neo-paganism and fascism and everything on the one side, of reinstantiating, sweeping aside the present order, reinstantiating a mythic past, or in Marxism on the other hand, he says in between this, he says there's a tertium quid, there's a third thing, a third way that allows us to re-embrace the living tradition of our own faith that still exists in our society. And that's, I think, where, but you have to actually engage it. You can critique it all you want. You can walk away from it all you want, but you fundamentally can't, you have to engage it for it to address the nihilism that's there. You have to sort of walk into it and embrace it. You can't just expect that the tradition is going to just magically solve, like Christianity doesn't magically solve all the questions that are thrust at it. Only the practice of Christianity can do that. In a sense, you have to meet God. And that really is, I think there's a lot of, and then there's the submission to the whole fundamental moral order. Cause this idea, if you can throw off the Christian faith, well, then you can learn, you have no more restraints, you can do whatever you want. But to me, that seems like the appeal for many of neo-paganism is that you get to fill that spiritual vacuum and void that modernity, the modernity that Nietzsche just merely documented, that nihilism can be filled, but it doesn't place any obligations on you, and you don't really require any work to get there, but you can get all the benefits from it anyways. At least that's kind of my take of it.
Yeah, let me just add a few things, because I like the way that I like to phrase it to people is that we need a kind of a little toolkit that you can crack open and have immediately available to you of things like certain terms.
Sure.
So romanticism. Romanticism is the movement where they're looking back at something that was considered to be ideal, and they're longing for it to make it that way again. Mm-hmm. And then there was what I had mentioned previously about neoclassicism. There's a little bit of overlap between these. In other words, looking back to the classics to make it new. There's some overlap here, and what happens is you get these neoclassicists, or we could call them neo-humanists, of Germany. They're traveling partners just for a little bit of the journey with the Romantics, and then they do their own thing, uh, and which we have as this German idealism. Uh, this is why Nietzsche takes great pains to distance himself from being referred to as a romantic. He says, no, 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 no. He says, I'm talking about, making the Greeks vital again for us today under our circumstances. I am not a romantic. In fact, Nietzsche has just an incredibly important way that he ends, in many respects, The Joy of Science, where he says it's simply titled Romanticism in My Sense. And Nietzsche is engaging all of these deep thinkers, from Herder to Kant and Schiller, Schleiermacher, all of these people, because again, he sees himself as recognizing that their efforts have failed, and has to be something new. But we need to keep in mind also, what do we even mean when we say modern, right? Because think about that. That is a concept that defines itself in terms of temporality. We're new, right? We're modern. We're up to date. So it really sort of captures exactly what the problem, in a sense, always is for
like
the
a
human.
postulatory divide in time.
Right, and it encompasses the fact that all of these movements, all of them, going all the way back to Plato and beyond, to us today, it's always the problem of. I don't really like this analogy, but it's one that Nietzsche uses, but it's the digestion of knowledge, right? How do we deal with new knowledge, right? Because here's the problem. For the Bible, there's no concept of nature, right? Of things having their own physis, right? In the sense of Aristotle or Plato. What you have instead is, in the biblical Hebrew, it's the word for the way of a people, right? This is, in other words, a path that has been trodden, right? That is the good. In other words, it's not a question of what is the good life, like Socrates or Aristotle. No, we know what the good life is, and it's to walk that path, the way of the people.
Yes, it's not an abstraction. It's
exactly.
It's something that's fundamentally done.
Exactly, and that's what becomes so problematic in the confluence of the Hellenic era. Of, on the one hand, what we could refer to as Jerusalem, right? In other words, biblical faith, divine revelation, and on the other hand, Athens. What happens when you have the power of something, of a knowledge that views things in terms of natures, right? In the sense of physis, right? In conjunction with what is supposed, what is, that is what it means. That's what divine revelation means. God has shown us, right? Well, how has he shown us? Well, it is the way of the people, right? This is the way. This is what the Bible means, or something. Yeah. And so, how do you reconcile?
Whom I will be. Walk with me, right. and you will learn who I am.
Right, but this gets us back to the problem of the German Renaissance. The question became, how do we even read a text, though? Because again, that's the problem of the ancients and the moderns. When it turns out that it is a very real effect that texts, as they have been transmitted through manuscripts and archives, contain certain errors. We don't have any. This is what's so hilarious. Even with Greek tragedy, we don't have any of the primary source stuff, except insofar as it's just, most people have no clue just how complicated archival manuscript work is. We have numerous different pieces of the same text, but they don't all match up. And so you've got to find a way to fit them all together. And so then it becomes, again, this is sort of like,
what is the text?
Exactly that. And that's the problem with the rise of what I refer to as contemporary biblical hermeneutics. People say, well, you've got these various stylistic authors. Well, hold on a second. Do you know the original language to see just how flimsy that case really is? Because it's not as sure set as you might think. While at the same time, people are not willing to grant just simply belief that this is the text protected by divine revelation through time. And so what happens, and this is where you really see what's sort of the problem. What happens in the 19th century is the culmination of all of this is, in other words, the reconciliation of this new knowledge. The best German thinkers in the world that ever were not just university professors. They traveled to the Middle East in search of manuscripts. We didn't know what biblical Hebrew was, and these people, many of these people, died over there. I mean, it's just insane. But here's what happens as a result. These are the questions that enter into the public conscious. The question of and I need to make sure I get the order right, because this is very important. There's the question of who is the historical Plato, right? Who was he? Then there's the question of, well, what about the historical Moses? Who was the historical Moses? Oh, it began with Homer. My bad. It was who was the historical Homer? So you go from Homer to Moses, and then Plato, and then you come to who was the historical Jesus. And that's what that's that last one. Who was the historical Jesus? Based on, and this is crucial, this is David Strauss's famous text, based on modern science. And it turns out that in other words, that requires all hermeneutics, archaeology, incorporation of understanding how to interpret so-called myths, hermeneutics, these things. And that seems to be always and everywhere the problem of man as such. But I would argue that the Bible takes that into consideration. That's the whole point of there being a way instead of this fascination with nature or physis. Most people don't realize that there's only one occurrence of the word philosophy in the New Testament, and it's where it's getting trashed. Philosophy gets trashed
in Corinthians by Paul.
Right. And so the question is this obsession with knowledge, is it, strictly speaking, biblically sanctioned, or is the much broader teaching, as we just read through the text, the fact that man is just supposed to be obedient in belief, right? Wisdom begins in fear of the Lord. Or, according to Plato and Aristotle, who are very explicit about this, wisdom begins in wonder. Well, what is wonder? Well, wonder is questioning. How did that happen? Is the Bible sanctioning for us to always be walking around questioning, or are we supposed to follow along the path of our Father? Right. That's that, and I love framing it that way.
Fundamentally, much more. Yeah, the biblical text is about walking away, like along a path, and the two paths is everywhere in the Old and the New Testament. Like this idea of walking along two paths.
And I love phrasing it that way to a lot of the younger guys, because that which is closest to us is always very often the hardest thing for us to understand, because we're so familiar with it, right? So we don't take into consideration how it is that our own family life might be affecting the way that we are trying to inquire into or make our way through these questions. And so when you phrase it in terms of, are you walking down the path that your father handed down to you? Would your ancestors be proud of you in the direction you're going? Because that really drives it home. And a lot of people get very offended when you ask them that, because that forces them to actually think about the issue and say, I wonder if my dad is ashamed of me, or something like that. I think that in that, the fact that we feel shame, or the fact that it touches us so poignantly, that, at least on my interpretation of this, that's what tells me that that's closer to what is properly human, because we have that experience with, it's like, wow, okay, I hadn't thought about it like that. I didn't realize that what I'm doing is siding with this abstraction known as science, instead of that which is properly and truly mine. In other words, my mother and my father, right? Well, my father, I phrase it that way. I just, let's leave mom out of it. But I think that's that's one way of really driving home so very much of all this otherwise deep philosophy or something like that. Is it's like, tell me about your dad, right? So what did Kryptos and
Yeah, tell me
Athenian
about
talk about today? It was really just they hit it, but what it really was the question of are you telling me something about your relationship with your father? Right? I mean, that's really what it sort of
your
comes down
father
to.
or fathers,
Yeah,
like, and
yeah,
that's, well, and like fathers is also partly community as well too. So it's the collective father. It's your own father, but also the collective father, because your uncles, the mentors. There's your relationship with your own father is always complicated, but there are other father figures who then walk alongside you and can add and fill a role in that your actual father. There's some things that the father figure can do that your actual father can't, and there's some things that your actual father can do that the father figure can't. So there's this sense of you need in some ways both men, right? Or
yeah. Let me
in that regard.
let me
Yeah,
just
go
add
ahead.
real quick. Let me add real quick to drive that point home, because that's crucial. We don't get to pick our father. However,
No.
we do see those around us that we might be drawn towards. And the way that I like to phrase it is I say, if size really matters, what's the most important text of the Bible? Well, it's the book of Psalms by far. Well, what does
Mhm.
one have to have in order to drive that point home? Well, that's why you get together in community and sing the Psalms. In other words, so
Yeah.
so, so that's where you have access to these other father figures or things like that you might not have. And so that community in the Psalms is another just absolutely definitive marker for
Well,
so
and
much of
and
this discussion.
and even the idea of the father is in that sense, redemptive in a world where your relationship with your own father can be problematic. And so there is a way that father relationship can be redeemed in your relationship with God the Father. There is this idea, I think, like, people have to understand that if, as you did, like with those men in the 1800s, they also flattened all of these texts as well too. So the Bible became just another text, just like the stories that the Grimm brothers were unearthing, or the Greek texts. That the biblical text was just another text that would be approached rationally and analytically. And so in this, and this is partly what the problem that Gadamer grapples with, is how do you make the text alive again, right? Does the text have any life of its own? And ultimately Gadamer argues that it does. And there's a big argument there, but it's a way of saying that for the biblical text to live, it has to live within a community that walks along the way, that walks the way already. The biblical text only lives because there's a living Christian community. And in part, these other texts, like there's one who, worships the Greek gods. There's no one who worships the Germanic gods. There is no living community. And are, for lack of a better word, they're fundamentally dead. And there's no way to really revivify them because there's a community within which they can be understood. And so I can understand an author like Athanasius or Clement or, a medieval Aquinas, in part because, in spite of the differences, I living community. And so when Aquinas talks to me, even though it comes from the now Roman tradition, there's fundamentally with it that we're speaking the same language, even if he's a new person that I'm in. So I can get to know Aquinas because we both walk in the. And this is, I think, the thing that Del Noce is trying to get at, if you put words on his mouth, and this thing where, because we interpret a biblical living tradition, it's never dead. It always lives within a living community that are interacting with it with a long passed on tradition. So now our society still bears the imprint of tradition, how much you wish to deny it. And so that living tradition, if you grew up in it, you maybe can convert to suicide and try to learn another narrative. Conversion is always a tremendous amount of effort. But, the Christian tradition has its own thing of discipleship. It can be to teach somebody, to inculcate them into the hard. But to just simply pick up a text and try to revivify it is tremendously difficult, if not impossible thing. I'm not sure that it can be done. I mean, you can make myths as an academic curiosity, but those live as, in terms of the hermeneutical problem is insurmountable, in my mind anyway.
The things that the listeners should be aware of is that you will see this if someone starts digging around on Amazon or something, this arise is in the phrase. Now
Yes.
That is crucial, because in the phrase itself, it has killed the Bible.
Dead manuscript now. It doesn't live anymore for that person.
It is different than any other text, right? They're
right.
all. And what is so fascinating to me, how much or how many people take that. Of course, the Bible. I mean, looks a book like any other book, and I just, it's like ancestors. But it's like no, you're fundamentally under the influence of. Just from the very premise that the Bible is it's like any other text. It's like any other literature. It's playing field.
Yeah. A lot of times the folks, well-meaning as they are, and I think grasping at something, and they're searching for some reason, Christianity is, but try the actual belief system, engage me on the teachings or whatever, and I'm like, but I'm not sure that they're, in many ways, the Poetic Edda you can read, glean some insight, only lives in of the 900s, and even that then, but separated via Christianity from prior to that. And tradition is there that enables you. There's not in the people that then gives context for most of us do old temple sacrifices anymore. So there's in the book of Leviticus, and it's unfortunate that we can't understand it better. A certain degree of living community that remains today, but is that there is, and so belief system, because we've talked about, you can play it, meaning and answers. Can't build a political system that have a kind of theology it's the foundation of what rules that govern our society. Establishing.
Yeah, let me because what you're addressing is, let me the problem with as we understand it, how different texts, and we're trying to bring it together. West now. I am not aware of any there's I mean, we've got this, we've got that. I mean, what can come from? How does it? Let me emphasize the way in which and recognize here with these philosophers, right? With her, not you can't even the